Hey folks, Mr. Howard here with Chapter 5 of Animal Farm. Last time on Animal Farm, we defended the farm again from a recapture by Jones. We met, well, not really met, we heard about Frederick and Pilkington, the two neighbors who represent Germany and England. We learned about how the pigeons are going to other farms and trying to convince them of animalism and teach them the song Beasts of England. So that one was more of like an international politics kind of a chapter in the allegory. But we're getting back to the farm itself. Things have gone pretty well on the farm overall. I mean, there are some troubling signs with the pigs and maybe their lack of physical labor and the way they're sort of taking over all of the, you know, running of the farm and all that kind of stuff. But really, they've thrown out the humans. They've been able to collect their own harvests and do all their own work. They defended the farm. They're happier. Things are generally going pretty well on Animal Farm. Let's see how Chapter 5 develops. As winter drew on, Molly became more and more troublesome. She was late for work every morning and excused herself by saying that she had overslept, and she complained of mysterious pains, although her appetite was excellent. On every kind of pretext, she would run away from work and go to the drinking pool where she would stand foolishly gazing at her own reflection in the water. Sort of a Narcissus moment. If you're looking for an illusion, maybe that's an allusion to Narcissus, the Greek myth where the guy was looking at himself in the water. She's definitely narcissistic. But there were also rumors of something more serious. One day, as Molly strolled blithely into the yard, flirting her long tail and chewing at a stalk of hay, Clover took her aside. "Molly," she said, "I have something very serious to say to you. This morning, I saw you looking over the hedge that divides Animal Farm from Foxwood. One of Mr. Pilkington's men was standing on the other side of the hedge, and I was a long way away, but I am almost certain I saw this. He was talking to you, and you were allowing him to stroke your nose. What does that mean, Molly?" "He didn't! I wasn't! It isn't true!" cried Molly, beginning to prance about and paw the ground. So remember, Molly is the upper class in this allegory, and she wants to get back together with the ruling class because she had a better life. Remember, redistributing the wealth helps the poor who have almost nothing. They end up with more than they had before. But it hurts the rich because it takes from them to redistribute. And so if Molly represents somebody who is in a beneficial relationship with the upper class, she's actually lost something. She's lost her ribbons. She's lost her sugar. She's lost her attention. She's just like every other animal now. "Molly, look me in the face. Do you give me your word of honor that the man was not stroking your nose?" It isn't true," repeated Molly, but she could not look Clover in the face. And the next moment she took to her heels and galloped away into the field. A thought struck Clover. Without saying anything to the others, she went to Molly's stall and turned over the straw with her hoof. Hidden under the straw was a little pile of lump sugar and several bunches of ribbon of different colors. 3 days later, Molly disappeared. For some weeks, nothing was known of her whereabouts. Then the pigeons reported that they had seen her on the other side of Willingdon. She was between the shafts of a smart dog cart painted red and black. Dog cart sounds weird. It was a kind of cart, like a two-wheeled buggy sort of cart, which was standing outside of a public house. A fat, red-faced man in check breeches and gaiters, who looked like a publican, a guy who owns a pub, was stroking her nose and feeding her with sugar. Her coat was newly clipped, and she wore a scarlet ribbon around her forelock. She appeared to be enjoying herself, so the pigeons said. None of the animals ever mentioned Molly again. So Molly has left Animal Farm. This is what the Russians would refer to as a defection, somebody who didn't like living under communist rule, which, they were surprised by. They didn't think anybody would not like living under communist rule. It's a utopia. But Molly didn't, and she left. So she's gone back to quote-unquote servitude in sort of the way that she was before. Let's see. In January, there came bitterly hard weather. The earth was like iron. There's a simile for you. And nothing could be done in the fields. Many meetings were held in the big barn, and the pigs occupied themselves with planning out the work of the coming season. It had come to be accepted that the pigs, who were manifestly cleverer than the other animals, should decide all questions of farm policy, though their decisions had to be ratified by a majority vote. This arrangement would have worked well enough if it had not been for the disputes between Snowball and Napoleon. These two disagreed at every point where disagreement was possible. If one of them suggested sowing a bigger acreage with barley, the other was certain to demand a bigger acreage of oats. If one of them said that such and such a field was just right for cabbages, the other would declare that it was useless for anything except roots. Each had his own following, and there were some violent debates. At the meetings, Snowball often won over the majority by his brilliant speeches, but Napoleon was much better at canvassing support for himself in between times. He was especially successful with the sheep. Of late, the sheep had taken to bleating 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, both in and out of season, and they often interrupted the meeting with this. It was noticed that they were especially liable to break into 4 legs good, 2 legs bad at crucial moments in Snowball's speeches. Pause. So the leadership struggle between Napoleon and Snowball is continuing and perhaps worsening. Snowball's a really good public speaker. He's Trotsky in this allegory. You can look him up if you want. A really good public speaker, really good at influencing people with his words. Napoleon, who is Stalin, is not nearly as good at that. But he's much better at talking to people before the meetings and getting people on his side. So he, quote unquote, canvasses support. He walks around the farm, getting people to side with him and declare that they will vote for him at the meeting, whether they're inspired to do so or not. Two very different strategies, one working beforehand or sort of politicking outside, and the other relying on the people and the motivation. Let's see, I lost my spot. Snowball had made a close study of some back numbers of the farmer and stock breeder, which he had found in the farmhouse, and was full of plans for innovations and improvements. And metaphorically or allegorically, this is Russia was a very backward country. It didn't have any of the modern equipment that other countries had. And so one of the first things that the Russians wanted to do once they had their own country was modernize. And Trotsky was a big fan of modernization. He was a big fan of getting modern equipment and industrializing Russia. And that's clearly what this is, sort of metaphorically speaking. He talked learnedly about field drains, silage, and basic slag, and had worked out a complicated scheme for all the animals to drop their dung directly in the fields at different spot every day to save the labor of cartage. Napoleon produced no schemes of his own, but said quietly that Snowballs would come to nothing, and seemed to be biding his time. But of all their controversies, none was so bitter as the one that took place over the windmill. In the long pasture, not far from the farm buildings, there was a small knoll, which was the highest point on the farm. After surveying the ground, Snowball declared that this was just the place for a windmill, which could be made to operate a dynamo and supply the farm with electrical power. This would light the stalls and warm them in the winter, and would also run a circular saw, a chaff cutter, a mango slicer, and an electric milking machine. The animals had never heard of anything of this kind before, for the farm was an old-fashioned one and had only the most primitive machinery. And they listened in astonishment while Snowball conjured up pictures of fantastic machines which would do their work for them while they grazed at their ease in the fields, or improved their minds with reading and conversation. Within a few weeks, Snowball's plans for the windmill were fully worked out. The mechanical details came mostly from 3 books, which had belonged to Mr. Jones. 1,000 Useful Things to Do About the House, Every Man His Own Bricklayer, and Electricity for Beginners. Pause for a second. Snowball represents a communist leader. He's not an engineer. And a workers' republic doesn't have sort of the background in scientists and things like that maybe other countries do. And these books, are these the kind of books you could build a functioning windmill with a dynamo with? 1,000 Useful Things to Do About the House, Every Man His Own Bricklayer, and Electricity for Beginners? What does this foreshadow about the windmill project? Anyway, Snowball used as his study a shed which had once been used for incubators and had a smooth wooden floor suitable for drawing on. He was closeted there for hours at a time, with his book held open by a stone and with a piece of chalk gripped between the knuckles of his trotter. He would move rapidly to and fro, drawing in line after line and uttering little whimpers of excitement. Gradually, the plans grew into a complicated mass of cranks and cogwheels covering more than half the floor, which the other animals found completely unintelligible but very impressive. All of them came to look at Snowball's drawings at least once a day. Even the hens and ducks came, and were at pains not to tread on the chalk marks. Only Napoleon held aloof. He had declared himself against the windmill, from the start. One day, however, he arrived unexpectedly to examine the plans. He walked heavily around the shed, looked closely at every detail of the plans, snuffed at them once or twice, then stood for a little while contemplating them out of the corner of his eye. Then suddenly he lifted his leg, urinated over the plans, and walked out without uttering a word. Guess that says what he thinks. The whole farm was deeply divided on the subject of the windmill. Snowball did not deny that to build it would be a difficult business. Stone would have to be carried and built up into walls, and the sails would have to be made, and after that there would be a need for dynamos and cables. How those were to be procured, Snowball did not say. That's one of the problems with a communist country too. If you look at a lot of communist countries, North Korea would be a good example. They try not to engage in trade with other countries. They want to be entirely self-sufficient. An animal farm is fairly self-sufficient, but how are animals going to produce electrical equipment on their farm? It's not they're going to have to trade. What are they going to trade with? Humans? Doesn't the commandment say that all humans are enemies? How is that going to happen? Right? So we've got to question that. Anyway, but he maintained that it could all be done in a year. And thereafter, he declared, so much labor would be saved that animals would only need to work 3 days a week. Napoleon, on the other hand, argued that the great need of the moment was to increase food production, and that if they wasted time on the windmill, they would all starve to death. The animals formed themselves into two factions under the slogans, "Vote for Snowball in the 3-day week," and "Vote for Napoleon and the full manger." Benjamin was the only animal who did not side with either faction. He refused to believe either that food would become more plentiful or that the windmill would save work. Windmill or no windmill, he said, life would go on as it had always gone on, that is, badly. So essentially, we have a two-party system starting to form here. Snowball at the head of one party and Napoleon at the head of the other. And what's interesting about it is they offer two different messages to their followers. And these messages are messages that you see all the time in politics. Snowball is offering his followers hope. He says, have a dream. The windmill, the 3-day week, your life can get better. Follow me and your life will get better. Napoleon offers fear. Do what the Snowball says and you'll all starve to death. You know, like, you don't want to starve to death, vote for me, right? And so we have the hope of a possibly better future juxtaposed or contrasted against the fear of what happens if you don't take care of your business immediately. And so the two platforms are hope and fear, and that's very much politics across the ages. You could look at the cycle we just went through. You could look at the cycle in 2016, or you could look at any cycle, and you'll see that these two poles are often the things, the emotions. Remember, we're talking about pathos here. Hope and fear, two different emotions that people are going to pull on to try and affect their supporters. Anyway, apart from the disputes over the windmill, there was a question of the defense of the farm. It was fully realized that though the human beings had been defeated in the Battle of the Cowshed, they might make another and more determined attempt to recapture the farm and reinstate Mr. Jones. They had all the more reason for doing so because the news of their defeat had spread across the countryside and made the animals on the neighboring farms more restive than ever. As usual, Snowball and Napoleon were in disagreement. According to Napoleon, what the animals must do was procure firearms and train themselves in the use of them. According to Snowball, they must send out more and more pigeons and stir up rebellion among the animals on the other farms. The one argued that if they could not defend themselves, they were bound to be conquered. The other that if the rebellions happened everywhere, they would have no need to defend themselves. The animals listened first to Napoleon, then to Snowball, and could not make up their minds which was right. Indeed, they always found themselves in agreement with the one who was speaking at the moment. Again, look at that. We've got very clearly Napoleon, we need guns or we're going to all die. Fear as a motivation. Snowball, well, we just need to have revolutions everywhere else, and then we won't need to defend ourselves. Hope, right? And they're contrasting each other. Where are they going to get the guns, by the way? Again, this is another question. At last the day came when Snowball's plans were completed. At the meeting on the following Sunday, the question of whether or not to begin work on the windmill was to be put to the vote. When the animals had assembled in the big barn, Snowball stood up and, though occasionally interrupted by bleating from the sheep, set forth his reasons for advocating the building of the windmill. Then Napoleon stood up to reply. He said very quietly that the windmill was nonsense and that he advised nobody to vote for it, and promptly sat down again. He had spoken for barely 30 seconds and seemed almost indifferent as to the effect he had produced. At this, Snowball sprang to his feet and shouted down the sheep, who had begun bleeding again, and broke into a passionate appeal in favor of the windmill. Until now, the animals had been about equally divided in their sympathies, but in a moment Snowball's eloquence had carried them away. In glowing sentences, he painted a picture of Animal Farm as it might be, when sordid labor was lifted from the animal's back. His imagination had now run far beyond chaff cutters and turnip slicers. Electricity, he said, could operate threshing machines, plows, harrows, rollers, and reapers, and binders, besides supplying every stall with its own electric light, hot and cold water, and an electric heater. Pause. There is no way one windmill is going to provide enough electricity to do all of those things. Clearly, Snowball's hope is getting away from him here a little bit. He's promising impossibilities. But again, how many politicians do that? By the time he had finished speaking, there was no doubt as to which way the vote would go. But just at this moment, Napoleon stood up and, casting a peculiar sidelong look at Snowball, uttered a high-pitched whimper of a kind no one had ever heard him utter before. He just gave Snowball the side eye. At this, there was a terrible baying sound outside, and 9 enormous dogs wearing brass-studded collars came bounding into the barn. They dashed straight for Snowball, who only sprang from his place just in time to escape their snapping jaws. In a moment, he was out of the door, and they were after him. Too amazed and frightened to speak, all the animals crowded through the door to watch the chase. Snowball was racing across the long pasture that led to the road. He was running as only a pig can run, but the dogs were close on his heels. Suddenly he slipped, and it seemed certain they had him. Then he was up again, running faster than ever. Then the dogs were gaining on him again. One of them all but closed his jaws on Snowball's tail. But Snowball whisked it free just in time. Then he put on an extra spurt, and with a few inches to spare, slipped through a hole in the hedge and was seen no more. Silent and terrified, the animals crept back into the barn. In a moment, the dogs came bounding back. At first, no one had been able to imagine where these creatures came from, but the problem was soon solved. They were the puppies, whom Napoleon had taken away from their mothers and reared privately. Though not yet full grown, they were huge dogs and as fierce-looking as wolves. They kept close to Napoleon. It was noticed that they wagged their tails to him in the same way as the other dogs had been used to Mr. Jones. Pause. So, Napoleon was going to educate the young. Did you all forget about those dogs? Isn't that what Orwell said he would do? Funny that. But yeah, those dogs were educated by Napoleon. They represent the first people to be educated in a communist country, to have no experience of what it was like under the previous rule. They only know what Napoleon wants them to know. And look at the way they treat him. They come up to him wagging their tails like they used to Mr. Jones. I thought all animals were equal. This seems to be a master-servants situation. And what do these dogs represent? You could argue that they represent the military. If you watch communist Russia videos from the height of communist Russia, they have these military parades with the missiles on trucks and the tanks going by and the soldiers. Maybe these dogs are them. Maybe the dogs represent the secret police, the KGB. There was a whole secret police that was run by the government, and they could wipe out anybody that they felt was a threat. But when the person in power has absolute power, he can wipe out anybody he wants, regardless of whether the person is a threat or not to the country or just to his leadership. But clearly, Napoleon just made a power move, and from here on out, he's essentially a communist dictator. And you'll see that power consolidate and intensify as the story goes on. And that's essentially what Stalin did. If you want to go and look up Joseph Stalin and follow his career on Wikipedia, I recommend you do. But he took power away from Trotsky, exiled Trotsky, who is Snowball in this situation. Then he conducted what was called the Great Purge. He felt insecure in his power, and so he used secret police to murder 1 million Russians who he felt were threats to his control. And after that, he was in complete control of Russia. We'll see what Napoleon does here, and if it's anything like what Stalin does. But yeah. Napoleon, with the dogs following him, now mounted onto the raised portion of the floor where Major had previously stood to deliver his speech. He announced, and look at the spatial symbolism here. All the animals were equal, but now Napoleon stands up on the raised portion, so he's higher than everybody else, where old Major used to stand. Let's see. He announced that from now on, the Sunday morning meetings would come to an end. They were unnecessary, he said, and wasted time. In the future, all questions relating to the working of the farm would be settled by a special committee of pigs presided over by himself. They would meet in private and afterwards communicate their decisions to the others. The animals would still assemble on Sunday mornings to salute the flag, sing Beasts of England, and receive their orders for the week, but there would be no more debates. So he consolidates power. We don't need debates. We don't need votes. The pigs know what's best. And Napoleon knows what's best for the pigs. In spite of the shock that Snowball's expulsion had given them, the animals were dismayed by this announcement. Several of them would have protested if they could have found the right arguments. Even Boxer was vaguely troubled. He set his ears back, shook his forelock several times, and tried hard to marshal his thoughts. But in the end, he could not think of anything to say. The importance of education? If these animals were educated, maybe they could defend themselves. But they can't. I mean, he can't get past D in the alphabet. How is he going to articulate an argument? Some of the pigs themselves, however, were more articulate. 4 young porkers in the front row uttered shrill squeals of disapproval, and all 4 of them sprang to their feet and began speaking at once. But suddenly the dogs sitting around Napoleon let out deep, menacing growls, and the pigs fell silent and sat down again. Then the sheep broke into a tremendous bleating of 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, which went on for nearly a quarter of an hour and put an end to any chance of discussion. Afterwards, Squealer was sent round the farm to explain the new arrangement to the others. But you know how we use sheep in America? Don't be a sheep, like as a political statement about people who don't think about the things that they're espousing and just follow a party line. That actually comes from this book. For what it's worth. You can see the sheep here are just following what they've been taught, and they're not thinking about anything. Now Squealer's got to convince the more intelligent animals that what Napoleon did was right. And remember, we want to look at rhetorical analysis here. We want to look at the art of persuasion and how Squealer gets to them. So I apologize again for my Squealer voice. It is what it is. Comrades, he said, I trust that every animal here appreciates the sacrifice that Comrade Napoleon has made in taking this extra labor upon himself. Do not imagine, comrades, that leadership is a pleasure. On the contrary, it is a deep and heavy responsibility. No one believes more firmly than Comrade Napoleon that all animals are equal. He would be only too happy to let you make your decisions for yourselves. But sometimes you might make the wrong decisions, comrades, and then where should we be? Suppose you had decided to follow Snowball with his moonshine of windmills. Snowball, who, as we know, was no better than a criminal. He fought bravely at the Battle of the Cowshed, said somebody. Bravery is not enough, said Squealer. Loyalty and obedience are more important. And as to the Battle of the Cowshed, I believe the time will come when we shall find that Snowball's part in it was much exaggerated. Discipline, comrades. Iron discipline. This is the watchword for today. One false step and our enemies would be upon us. Surely, comrades, you don't want Jones back. Once again, this argument was unanswerable. Certainly the animals did not want Jones back. If the holding of debates on Sunday mornings was liable to bring him back, then the debates must stop. Boxer, who had now had time to think things over, voiced the general feeling by saying, If Comrade Napoleon says it, it must be right. And from then on, he adopted the maxim, Napoleon is always right, in addition to his private motto of, I will work harder. Pause. Let's go back up to the top of Snowball's speech. He starts out again with comrades, friends, equals. I trust that every animal here appreciates the sacrifice that Comrade Napoleon has made in taking this extra labor upon himself. Do not imagine, comrades, that leadership is a pleasure. On the contrary, it is a deep and heavy responsibility. Napoleon doesn't want to be leader. It's a lot of work. He'd rather not be in charge of everything. He's doing it because he loves you, right? Like, interesting spin. He doesn't want this responsibility. Yes, he does. He's been trying to get it from Snowball the entire time, but whatever. No one believes more firmly than Comrade Napoleon that all animals are equal. Is that true? Why is he in charge of the dogs? Why do they wag their tails at him? Why is he standing up on a platform? Why is he abolishing the Sunday meetings where every animal has a say and a vote? Saying that Napoleon believes all animals is equal doesn't make it true. He would be only too happy to let you make your decisions for yourselves, but sometimes you might make the wrong decisions, comrades, and then where should we be? Rhetorical question, letting them sort of fill in the answer. Suppose you had decided to follow Snowball with his moonshine of windmills. Moonshine of windmills, of course, the metaphor. Windmills are not moonshine. Moonshine is an alcohol that makes people blind drunk. Snowball, who, as we know, was no better than a criminal. Well, he throws that in there, like, why does he throw that in there? Because it stops people from thinking about the earlier part of the statement. He just snuck in there that the windmill is moonshine, the windmill is nonsense, and it needed to be stopped. And you have to agree with him because you're too busy thinking about the second part of the sentence, which is that Snowball was a criminal. Now he's undermining Snowball's ethos, Snowball's reputation, right? We want to make you not want to follow Snowball because he's a bad person. But the animals are unconvinced. He fought bravely at the Battle of the Cowshed. Snowball's response, or Squealer's response, is bravery is not enough. Loyalty and obedience are more important. So he's underlying the importance of being loyal and obedient. These are the things that obviously Napoleon wants. As to the Battle of the Cowshed, I believe the time will come when we shall find Snowball's part in it was much exaggerated. That's foreshadowing. Then he says discipline. So that's another word. The words that Napoleon wants people to have, as opposed to bravery, are loyalty, obedience, and discipline. One false step and our enemies would be upon us. Surely you don't want Jones back. We end with that question again. If they protest about what's happened, then surely they want Jones back, and this makes them traitors. And so they can't even respond to that. Anyway, let's finish the chapter. By this time, the weather had broken and spring plowing had begun. The shed where Snowball had drawn his plans of the windmill had been shut up, and it was assumed that the plans had been rubbed off the floor. Every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, the animals assembled in the big barn to receive their orders for the week. The skull of old Major, now clean of flesh, had been disinterred from the orchard and set up on a stump at the foot of the flagstaff beside the gun. Pause. That's really creepy. They've got old Major's skull there as a symbol of their sort of founding father. Well, it turns out that when Lenin died, they actually mummified his body and put it in a glass coffin where people could observe it. This is true. You can look that up as well. It's kind of creepy and disturbing, but there it is. After the hoisting of the flag, the animals were required to file past the skull in a reverent manner before entering the barn. Nowadays, they did not sit all together as they had done in the past. Napoleon, with Squealer and another pig named Minimus, who had a remarkable gift for the composing of songs and poems, sat on the front of the raised platform, with the 9 young dogs forming a semicircle round them, and the other pigs sitting behind. The rest of the animals sat facing them in the main body of the barn. Napoleon read out the orders for the week in a gruff, soldierly style, and after a single singing of Beasts of England, all the animals dispersed. Well, let's look at the spatial symbolism again. Like they used to all mingle together because they were all equals, but now they don't sit together as they had in the past. Napoleon, Squealer, and Minimus sat on front of a raised platform with 9 young dogs forming a circle around them, protected by the dogs, raised above the rest, and the other pigs sitting behind. So they're sitting in between the pigs and the other animals. So somehow there's a line of demarcation between party members and the rest of the population. So I think that's interesting too. We have definite sort of classism coming into play. Somehow the pigs are separate and better than other animals. On the third Sunday after Snowball's expulsion, the animals were somewhat surprised to hear Napoleon announce that the windmill was to be built after all. He did not give any reason for having changed his mind, but merely warned the animals that this extra task would mean very hard work. It might even be necessary to reduce their rations. The plans, however, had all been prepared down to the last detail. A special committee of pigs had been at work upon them for the past 3 weeks. The building of the windmill with various other improvements was expected to take 2 years. Well, that's a change out of left field. Napoleon was very anti-windmill, and now he's like, yeah, we should build that windmill. Well, it's true that Stalin decided that he wanted to modernize Russia. And so, if the windmill represents, on one hand, I think the windmill is symbolic of hope. And everybody needs hope. And I think Napoleon even realizes that his animals need hope. They can't live on fear alone. They need to have something to hope for and to work for, and the windmill represents that. But I think it also, in the allegory, represents the modernizing of Russia. You can't have a backwards country and expect to be a major player and have any power on the global stage. You have to modernize. And Stalin definitely did that. And so the windmill is going to represent the industrialization or the modernization of Russian technology. But anyway, that evening, Squealer explained privately to the other animals that Napoleon had never in reality been opposed to the windmill. On the contrary, it was he who had advocated it from the beginning. And the plan which Snowball had drawn on the floor of the incubator shed had actually been stolen from among Napoleon's papers. Pause. Do you buy this? Seem believable to you? The windmill was, in fact, Napoleon's own creation. Why then, asked somebody, had he spoken so strongly against it? Here Squealer looked very sly. That, he said, was Comrade Napoleon's cunning. He had seemed to oppose the windmill simply as a maneuver to get rid of Snowball, who was a dangerous character and a bad influence. Now that Snowball was out of the way, the plan could go forward without his interference. This, said Squealer, was something called tactics. He repeated it a number of times. Tactics, comrades! Tactics! Skipping round and whisking his tail with a merry laugh. The animals were not certain what the word meant, but Squealer spoke so persuasively, and the 3 dogs who happened to be with him growled so threateningly that they accepted his explanation without further questions. And that is the end of Chapter 5. If you have questions for me, drop them in the comments. I will be happy to answer them. Certainly some of you might. Or observations that you want to make that you'd like to get some commentary on. I'm happy to answer as well. Thanks for your attention, and we'll jump into Chapter 6 next time.